I don't know if it was America's 250th or the fact that we've been having this worship series coinciding with America's 250th, but when I heard Jesus' famous words from our reading today, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," the very first thing I thought of was this poem that I must have memorized in like 5th grade or something about the Statue of Liberty. Maybe you've heard this poem, that it ends like this: "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Sounds kind of similar to the weary and burdened coming to Jesus, the homeless, the tempest-tossed coming to America. That poem really has gotten into the DNA of our country, or at least it addresses the DNA of our country. America has always been this place where people who were doing poorly, who were down and out in other countries, who needed a fresh start, they could come to America. And America offered them the freedom to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, to work really hard and make a new life for themselves. And really, America, to a great extent, has delivered on that promise. Think about how many stories you have heard of people who came to New York City, who passed by that Statue of Liberty, landed at Ellis Island with nothing but $20 in their pocket. And they were able to work, get a job, and then eventually they worked really hard and they saved up, and maybe they bought a corner store that they owned or some farmland, and they continued to work really hard and they created a new life for themselves. America is a place where people are free to work as much as they want to. But of course, that culture also has a downside. And if you've been following the World Cup at all, maybe you've realized this, that people from other countries are able to apparently take like 5 weeks of work off in a row and just fly over to America. They bought a one-way ticket and they're gonna stay as long as their country is in it. They're just gonna hang out. They're going to explore America a little bit. They're gonna stay in all these hotels. And whether it's 3, 4, 5, or 6 weeks, eventually they'll get back to their job. Can you imagine doing that? When's the last time you took 5 weeks in a row off of work? In America, we work hard, but we don't really know how to rest very well. You and I don't rest as much as we should, and we know this, but what are we going to do? We live in America. Unless we move to Spain or something, this is the life that we live. So I'll speak for myself. When I first read this reading, preparing this sermon for this week, I really struggled to grapple with what Jesus meant by rest, because my American brain hears rest and I think, okay, that's a nice long weekend away from work. That's getting out of town for a little bit to the lake house or something. Or maybe Jesus is offering rest by giving me 15 minutes at the beginning of each morning before I open the laptop and get to the emails, to rest my emotions, rest my thoughts, take some time away. Jesus does offer that. But we don't want to reduce Jesus to the equivalent of a morning crossword puzzle. The rest that Jesus offers is so much greater and so much deeper, and that's the kind of rest that we're going to be talking about and diving into this morning, as we see that Jesus is able to provide us this rest because of who he is and how he delivers it directly into who we are. So first, Jesus is able to give this rest because of who he is. The last part of the reading is the famous part, and rightfully so, because these are beautiful words about Jesus giving rest to our souls. But don't miss the first half of the reading too. It's pretty remarkable. Jesus says that he and God the Father are in perfect unity. They know each other perfectly, and no one is able to know the Father except through his Son, Jesus. If you were to ask a bunch of people in our country, how do you get to know God? I think a lot of them would say that you have to go on a journey and find him yourself. Jesus doesn't say that. He says, I am the only way that you get to know the Father. If I tell you something is from the Father, that's true. If I withhold something, then you don't know that about the Father. So that raises the question then, well, Jesus, who are you going to tell about the Father? Jesus says, no one knows the Father except the Son and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. And then his very next words, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. That's who Jesus wants to reveal God to. The weary and the burdened. Well, who are those people? Are they the people who are working more than 40 hours a week? Are they the people who have kids? Are they the people who are going something challenging in their life right now, or they have some trauma in their past that keeps coming up? Who are the weary and the burdened? Well, yes, to all of those. Those people are weary and burdened. But Jesus is talking again about more than physical weariness or emotional burdenedness. He's talking about a weariness of the soul. And we know that because he says so. This rest that he offers is for our souls. But we also know that because of when he said these words. Jesus was prompted to say this, we're told, at that time. At what time? Well, if you would go and look in the verses just before our reading started, Jesus had been going around to towns in Galilee and actually warning them pretty strongly, not really bringing them rest so much as unrest. Because for months and years, Jesus had gone around this region called Galilee, and he had been teaching the good news that he had brought the kingdom of God near. He had been doing all sorts of miracles to prove that he was truly from God, that what he says was how God was. And many people believed, but many rejected him. Many preferred the system of the traditional religions to Jesus. They preferred what their old religious teachers had been teaching them largely because their religious teachers told them they could earn their way into God's good graces by working. And so they gave them a very set, very defined list. If you do these things, God will bless you. If you carry out these moral values, if you go along with these rituals, if you do all the right things, God will love you and care for you, and he will do good things in your life. Jesus opposed these people because Jesus brought, as we talked about last week, his kingdom of grace, his kingdom of forgiveness. But sometimes we still struggle with that urge to think we need to prove ourselves before God, don't we? Sometimes we have it in our minds that God is doing bad or allowing bad things to happen to us, or he's doing good to us because of something we've done, and now God is either punishing or rewarding us. We all have that little voice inside of us, that same little voice that all of the people back then in Galilee had, that little voice that creates such a burden. Jesus told the religious teachers that they were, with these lists of things to do, they were piling burdens on top of people, burdens that they are not able to carry. These people are not able to carry out all of these things to be perfect before God. We too have a voice that burdens us. And our culture sometimes gives us fuel, ammunition, or gives the voice ammunition to use against us. Culture might say, you're not doing enough at work. You need to produce more. You need to make more. You need to achieve higher. And so we start to equate that voice with who we are at our core. We're someone who is doing fine, but not good enough. Or maybe you grew up in a church or a synagogue or some other religious tradition where the gospel wasn't preached, and so you heard all of these things that you needed to do before God, and that voice has stayed with you. That voice of, yeah, you're a pretty good person, but you're not perfect. And that voice becomes who you think you are in your core. Or maybe your voice gets ammunition from our culture's idea that you have to find yourself. You have to be the one to go out there and figure out who you are, what you like, the things you like to do, the ways you spend your time, what your contribution is to the world. And maybe that's not so obvious as you think it should be. And you start to equate that little voice telling you you don't even know who you really are with who you are in your core. You're someone who doesn't know yourself. The sociologist named Jonathan Haidt, he recently got famous for a book called The Anxious Generation. Before he wrote that book, he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. And Jonathan Haidt is not a Christian, but he keyed in on something, he realized something about human nature that's very much in line with the Bible. Jonathan Haidt says, all of those voices that are creating burdens for you, whatever your voice might be specifically saying, whatever burden you might be carrying today, it comes from the same place. It comes from this innate need to see ourselves as righteous. This need to look at the things we do and the way we spend our time and how we treat others and be able to say, no, I was right, I was right, I was right, I was righteous in those instances. But here's the thing. We're not always righteous in those instances. And we can't trick this voice. We can't trick these burdens. Our voice within us knows that we have not been righteous, no matter how much we try and tell ourselves that we are. And so there are a couple ways we can try and deal with this. We can tell ourselves, no, even though I'm imperfect, I am enough. I am good enough. I am flawed, but I am a good person. Or we can hear what Jesus reveals from God to us. That yes, we are imperfect. Yes, we are deeply flawed. Yes, we continually fight with that sin, like the Apostle Paul wrote about in Romans 7. It keeps coming back. But we can come to Jesus because Jesus came just for people like us. He came for people who are weary of trying to stomp out that voice within us, telling us all the ways that we have not been perfect. Jesus came and he takes those burdens off of us. The burden to work harder, to achieve more, Jesus takes off of us. The burden to be a better person, to hold to our morals more often, Jesus takes that burden off of us. The burden of trying to find ourselves, of prove to ourselves who we are and prove that who we are is a good and righteous person, Jesus takes that burden off of us. Because did you notice the contrast? The first half of the reading, Jesus says he is God. He communicates God to us. But the second half, he says, I'm gentle. I'm humble in heart. Jesus used his divine power, his divine knowledge, not to slap us across the face and tell us to do better, but instead he made himself humble. And he came and lived among us, and he actually achieved the perfect life. He could look at God the Father in the face and say, I have been righteous. And then he gave that righteousness to you. He gave all of his perfection to you. So that when God looks at you, he no longer sees the failings of the past. He no longer sees the strivings for all of the wrong things. Instead, he sees perfection. Jesus delivers his perfection into who you are, so you can finally put that little voice, you can put those burdens to rest. I have a friend who I've made in the last year in the city. She's just became a lawyer, and she told me I could share this story with you today about how this played out in one situation in her life. So we were talking about the bar exam, which of course is the notoriously challenging test you have to pass if you want to be a lawyer. And the bar exam, it surprised me to know, it's 2 days long. There's a morning and an afternoon session both days, and it's incredibly stressful. But the main thing my friend remembers from the bar, and I'll try to be as kosher with this as I can, is how bad the bathrooms smelled. Because that building, where people regularly took the bar, the people would go into the bathrooms and they were so tense, they were so nervous, they were so caught up in needing to pass this test that it just destroyed their intestines. And my friend realized the first time maybe not the first time she went into the bathroom, but after a certain time, she realized that so many other people taking this test, their identity depended on whether or not they passed that test. Their sense of who they were depended on which bubbles they filled in. And my friend was instantly so grateful. Because the bar was incredibly challenging. She had studied all summer for it. She had stressed about it. She had worried about it, certainly. But when she got in to take the test, she knew that her identity was not based on her performance. Whether she passed or failed, whether she passed the second time or failed the second time, whether she became a lawyer, whether she didn't, whether she became a great lawyer, whether she made it to the Supreme Court, or whether she was the worst lawyer and out of a job within a year. She's a good lawyer, as far as I know. But whether or not, no matter how she performed, her identity did not depend on her performance. Because the truest, the most core part of herself is the perfection that Jesus has given her. And so in that room taking the bar, even as she took one of the most challenging tests in our country, she was at rest. We can have that rest too. We do have that rest. We need to learn to live in that rest more often. And that's why Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." Learn how to live in that rest. Learn how to live in the rest of knowing that you are right with God. And going back to our worship series, to put a knot on it all, we talked about how the government provides all sorts of challenges, all sorts of questions for us. God established the government, and yet why does it look like this? Our rest does not depend on whether we get the right policies passed, whether the right people get into power. Our rest depends on Jesus. Do we want the right policies to be passed? Do we want the right people to be in power? Absolutely, and we fight for that. But that doesn't affect the core of who we are in Jesus. And the church. Crossroads is a growing church, but many churches in America are not growing. And like Pastor Strutz said last week so well, sometimes we think, man, what is this group I've gotten myself into? Is this really the winning team to be on? And we can worry about that. But because of Jesus, we know that we are completely at rest. And because Jesus gives this mission to the church, that rest is going to more people. More and more people every day are having their souls put at rest because of Jesus. So come to Jesus, you who are weary and burdened, and he will give you rest. Yes, even in this economy. Amen.